This is Dave Gaddis, and today is April 28th, 2015, and today we're talking with Dr. Fred Steiner here at the University of Texas in his office, and so I'd like to welcome you. Let's always start at the beginning and tell us when and where you were born.
I was born in March 1949 in Dayton, Ohio.
Okay, and what did your parents do that had them in Dayton, Ohio?
My father owned a tavern and my mother was an accountant.
Okay. Did you stay in Dayton your whole childhood, or did you move around?
No, stayed in Dayton until I went to college.
Okay, and where did you go to college?
The University of Cincinnati.
Okay, and what made you choose Cincinnati?
I was really good in art,
Okay.
and decided I wanted to be a designer, and the University of Cincinnati had the best school of art, architecture, and design in the state of Ohio.
Okay, do you remember any of the faculty or classmates from your undergraduate days?
Yeah, I do.
Anybody stand out in your mind?
One is a guy named Alan Ward, who works with Sasaki. He was the chief urban designer for Sasaki in Boston, and I remember him from the dark room at the University of Cincinnati.
So after you got your undergraduate, did you go on to graduate school or did you work?
I did. Well, Cincinnati has what's called a co-op program. So after your second year, if you're in design, architecture, or engineering, you work for 3 months and you go to school for 3 months. So when I was doing one of my co-ops, I started to work for a Newtown developer back in Dayton, Ohio. And Columbia and Reston had just been built, and there was sort of a new community movement in the United States at the time. Under the Nixon administration, what was called HUD Title VII was passed, which funded a series of new towns around the United States, including the Woodlands here in Texas. So I went to work for a developer, and it was at that point I decided I wanted to pursue planning. So when I went back after my co-op section, I took a planning course and read Design with Nature, and decided that that's the kind of planning I wanted to do. So I finished my undergraduate degree in Cincinnati and went back to work for the Newtown developer. And
who was the developer?
His name was Donald Huber.
Okay, and did his project come to fruition? Or?
Nope. Of the 15 HUD Title VII new communities, each of which got a $50 million federal guaranteed loan, 14 went bankrupt. The only one that was successful was the Woodlands in Texas. And I think because part of the reason was George Mitchell was an oil man, and he was a geologist and had a very long view of planning, whereas most of the other developers were home builders, and their sort of time horizon was shorter lived and shorter vision. So no, it was one of the 14 of the 15 HUD Title VII communities that weren't successful.
Okay. So after your undergraduate?
I got my first planning degree at, there was sort of a minor political scandal when I was working for the Newtown before it went bankrupt, and so I found myself wanting to go back to graduate school, and it was the middle of the year, and the applications had passed. So the University of Cincinnati, I kind of had a good record there, and I'd been a yearbook editor and a whole bunch of things like that, and so I got accepted back to the University of Cincinnati for their master's program in planning. Decided I wanted to go to Penn and work with McHarg all the way along, but I'd missed the deadline. So I applied to Penn the next year, was accepted, and met McHarg when he came to give a talk at the American Society of Civil Engineers conference in Cincinnati. And he advised me to finish my degree at Cincinnati and take biology and geology, which were prerequisites for his program at Penn, because he told me they were much less expensive at Cincinnati than they would be at Penn, which he was right. And he thought it was good for me to go ahead and finish my degree at Cincinnati. So I finished my first master's in planning at Cincinnati, then went to Penn, was in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning, and I was in the regional planning track at Penn.
And did you get another master's, or did you start working on a doctorate?
No, I got another master's, and then went out, and I thought I was going to go back building new towns and doing that sort of thing, but the recession sort of kicked in at that point in the 70s. And I ended up teaching. I ended up going to Washington State University, writing about my experience with the new town. And so I went to work. Washington State University had just started a planning program, and they'd also just started a landscape architecture program. Well, they had a landscape architecture program, but they wanted to get it accredited. So they were building the faculty, and they wanted somebody from Penn, and I was the only one who applied, so I got the job. And so I went to Eastern Washington and worked at Washington State University. Got a Fulbright to the Netherlands, and decided that it would be good to get back to Penn and get my PhD, which I did.
Okay. And tell me about Ian McHarg. He was quite a character, as I understand.
Ian McHarg was quite a character, yeah. He was a very funny man, a very smart man, very idealistic. My first experience at Penn, I knew him, but not well. When I went back to work on my PhD, I co-taught with him, so I got to know him much better then. And he was working on his autobiography, and by that time I had sort of developed experience publishing, and his publisher asked if I would help him gather the illustrations and help structure the autobiography, which I did, and I got to know him much better. I'd say we became pretty good friends as a result of that experience. Okay.
And did he lead your dissertation committee, or did...
No, he didn't. I had thought about going to law school, and so I put 2 lawyers on my committee. And Ian, for all of his, he had lots of good attributes, and one of them was he was very fiercely loyal to all of his former students, Kent Butler included, and Pliny Fisk here in Austin, and Austin Lee Brock. There's a whole bunch of his former students here in Austin. Ian was fiercely loyal, and but at the same time, he was a bit of a cheerleader, but he didn't really read much of what you wrote. So I thought about being a lawyer, and my favorite courses at Penn had been in planning law and in environmental law. So there were 2 planner lawyers. One was Anne Strong, and the other was John Keene. And so I asked, Anne Strong was my dissertation advisor. Okay. She was wonderful, actually, and extraordinarily rigorous and very thorough, as was John Keene. So I had 2 real tough dissertation committee members, and then Ian was always cheering me along. So that was appreciated, but Anne was an outstanding dissertation advisor.
And what was your dissertation on?
Well, I had thought, Anne had worked a lot with the Brandywine and the Brandywine Valley, and I had done some work on the Brandywine for my master's thesis at Penn. So I thought about doing I thought about writing about the Brandywine, and Anne very wisely suggested there were more people at Penn that knew more about the Brandywine than I would ever know. So write about something that no one at Penn knew anything about. So I wrote about the Palouse of Eastern Washington and soil conservation policy.
Okay. And so you're a newly minted PhD. Did you go straight into a teaching job? Or?
No, I'd already been in a teaching job. I just took a leave from my teaching and went back to Washington State.
Okay.
So I had, by that time, I had tenure before I got my PhD.
Oh, okay, that's unusual.
Yeah, and a couple books too, so that was.
Okay, and what books were those?
One was called The Politics of Newtown Planning, and that was about the new town in Ohio, and the other was Ecological Planning for Farmland Preservation. which was work that I had done on a county level planning in eastern Washington. And then I edited a book on farmland preservation as well.
I think I've seen that. APA Press.
Yep.
You still that or
yep.
Published that? Yeah.
Yep.
So how long were you at Eastern Washington?
I was at Washington State for 10 years, but I was in the Netherlands for a year and I was at Penn for a year, so I kept leaving the Palouse and coming back. So basically from 1977 to 1987, it was my home base.
Okay. And where did you go from there?
University of Colorado.
Okay. And also in the planning program?
I was in the planning program and I was head of a community design center.
Okay. And then how long were you there?
Only 2 years, and then I got recruited away from Colorado to go to Arizona State University.
You were at Arizona State for a while, right?
I was at Arizona State for 12 years, yeah. I was the director of the School of Planning and Landscape Architecture at Arizona State.
Okay. And who were some of the other faculty members at Arizona State at that time?
Richard Lai was one of the faculty members. He taught planning law. Ignacio San Martin, who went on to teach at the University of Minnesota. Laurel McSherry, who now teaches at Virginia Tech. David Piofka, who is still at Arizona State.
Okay. I knew Margot Garcia.
Margot came, had left right before I came.
Okay.
So Margot and I know Margot well too, but we didn't overlap. She left the year before I came.
Okay.
Maybe 2 years before I came, but right around the same time.
Okay. And then after Arizona State, you came here?
I came here.
Okay.
I've been here for 15 years now.
Okay. Well, time flies.
Yeah.
Any particular research interests that you look into, or?
Well, land suitability analysis has been sort of my consistent, and environmental impact assessment have been probably the two constants. I was in conservation policy, soil and water conservation policy, especially when I was living in rural areas, and open space issues certainly as well.
Okay. And then when you got here, some of the faculty members here that stand out in your mind?
Well, I actually knew more of the faculty at Texas A&M than here. I don't know if I should admit that or not. And I had a lot of friends. I still have a lot of friends at A&M. The faculty member that I knew best here was Kent Butler, and Kent had a somewhat similar background to me at Penn, and I knew his work, and we had similar research interests. So of the faculty, he was the person when I came I knew the best, and of course now I know everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, as I recall, Kent was on the faculty here, took a leave of absence to go work at LCRA for a while, and then came back.
He took a leave to basically create the Balcones Canyonland Conservation District, and did a lot of very important work for LCRA, and he was a real pioneer in both water planning and habitat conservation planning. And
we'll mention for the record his unfortunate passing.
Yeah, it
2 years
seems
now, or?
Longer than that, but it seems like yesterday. Yeah. He died hiking in Yosemite. Yeah. Basically, from what I understand, it was a slippery day, and he was helping others on the trail when he slipped and fell over the edge and fell into the ravine and unfortunately died.
Yeah. Well, we talked about some of your early books. Are there later books that you're particularly proud of? Or?
Well, my most recent ones are Designed for a Vulnerable Planet, and what's the other one called? It's Urban Ecological Design, are the two of the most recent ones. Urban Ecological Design I did with an Italian colleague of mine called, his name is Danilo Palazzo, and Danilo is now the director of the School of Planning at University of Cincinnati. Okay. And so basically the application of ecology to urban design. And then Design for a Vulnerable Planet is a series of essays about design and planning in this first urban century.
Okay. Well, part of what we're doing is talking about the American Planning Association and its predecessors. And when did you first get involved in APA or AIP?
I first got involved, it was still AIP at the time, and also ASPO.
Okay.
When I was a student. I was a student member of AIP at Cincinnati.
Okay.
So, I don't know, 1973, 74.
Okay.
I was a charter APA member.
Right.
And I was both AIP member and a ASPO member at the time.
So then you ended up with one member for the price of two.
I did, when they merged, yeah.
Okay.
I got a little certificate saying I was a charter APA member.
And did you go on to get your AICP?
I didn't.
Okay. You know, there's been a lot of controversy lately about faculty and AICP, and do you have any particular thoughts on that?
Well, I applied. And they told me I wasn't qualified. I was in the initial year, was in 1980 or 1981, and so I filled in the application, and by that time I had 2 planning degrees from accredited schools and had worked as a planner both for a developer and a county planner for about almost 10 years. So, and then been an academic for a couple of years. So I talked to Paul Farmer about it. He said, well, that was those first couple of years they had hired law students from Georgetown and they made some mistakes. So I guess I was one of the mistakes.
Well, over your career, you've mentored a lot of students. Are there any students of yours that you're particularly proud of?
Oh gosh, yeah, a lot of them. There's so many and many of them are planning directors or they own their own firms now. So I've been very fortunate with the students who have graduated from all the schools that I taught at.
And the flip side of that are people that have served as your mentors, and I guess obviously Ian may have been one of them, but any others that stand out as mentors?
Well, Ian Strong was certainly very important. At Cincinnati, there was a man named Harris Farouz and another man named Tom Jenkins that were very important. Also, it's at Penn, Ed Bacon was an influence, as was John Keene. Seymour Mendelbaum was as well. Laurie Olin, there are quite a few of the landscape architecture faculty at Penn, in addition to the planning faculty, Laurie Olin being probably the most important of that group.
Okay. If you had any advice to give a young planner coming out of school, what might it be? I
think learn how to write really well, and take as much law as you can. I think planning, the courses that I took in planning law have always been things that still have been very, very helpful. I was at a zoning hearing just about 2 weeks ago, and we were waiting to present a case for the university, and there was a dispute, and it was interesting because I knew the answers that the city attorney was going to give before she gave them, but it was just based on knowing the law.
We've talked some about APA. Are there other organizations that you've been fairly active in, ACSP or ASLA or
both? I'm sort of rewinding the question about former students, and there are several that went on to be academics. Donna Erickson, who went on to be the chair of the landscape architecture program at the at the University of Michigan, and Joan Hirschman Woodward went on to Cal Poly and taught. Have a young guy who's finishing his PhD at Penn right now who's going to be a really important planner, I think. Billy Fleming is his name. And I keep, that was a very good question, and it's one that I was hesitant at first because the ones I would miss. A guy named Michael Collins, who I was on his PhD committee as well as his master's committee. George Newman from Washington State, who has had a terrific career up in the Northwest, and Joanne Hanley, who went on to the National Park Service, Kate Day, John Thylacker. And there's a lot from here as well. Billy Fleming being one of the most recent. I'm wrapping up a PhD student, Jane Winslow, who's really terrific as well. So a lot of good students.
If you think of some more, that's okay.
They keep fleshing through the ones that they really have had. A lot of them have gone on in Washington, Colorado, Arizona, and Texas, but many have gone to other places, and have been are planning directors, or have had really important academic and other government positions. It's been a lot of good ones. I was through APA and ACSP. I was on the Planning Accreditation Board for 2 terms, so I was very active with PAB. Still am active as a site reviewer and so on. And as a result of that, got in the middle of some of the AICP controversy. I think what I argued for, advocated for, the not being an AIC member, I would say I think my circumstance was just an oddity of timing as much as anything else. I think it's a valuable it's a valuable credential for planners. What I think where it would fit most well in the accreditation process is as an outcome measure. So rather than necessarily requiring faculty to have AICP, I think it's a good measure of the outcome of success for your graduates. What I think would be better, or a reasonable requirement for planning faculty, is that they graduate from an accredited school themselves. I think that in being responsible for a school that includes architects and landscape architects, it wouldn't occur to the architects or the landscape architects not to hire someone who graduated from an accredited architecture program. Now, I'm also right now on the board of AIA, and I know licensure in AIA is also a controversial issue, because only half our graduates in architecture go on and get licensure and go on to AIA. So
is that because they're not practicing, or they just chose not to go?
That's a big question. It's a big question, and one that there's a lot of debate in AIA. My own, I think there's a lot of factors, but I think one factor is architecture school takes so long, and then there's a fairly long apprenticeship after that before you can get licensed. And if you have an economic slowdown like we've had the last couple of years, now it didn't happen in Texas, of course, but the rest of the world experienced economic slowdown. So if you have a young architect and they've been out for a year and they're waiting to get licensed, and then they're out of a job, restarting that is very difficult. So I think for architecture, that somehow shortening the time between getting your degree in architecture and getting licensed would be a good thing. Landscape architecture is very similar. They lose a good number as well. And so I think that's a factor. But I think for faculty, I think planning is mature enough. I can understand, you know, at one point in time why, and I still think it's valuable as an interdisciplinary field to have people from a variety of backgrounds. But I think that it's reasonable to have a critical mass of planning faculty who have gone through planning programs.
You mentioned the fact that the program here is a combination of planning, architecture, landscape architecture. Any other disciplines in the program here?
In the school, there's also urban design, interior design, sustainable design, and architectural history.
Okay. And there's obviously some benefits to that synergy between the program, or are there some, you know, other schools have them set up differently? Yeah,
schools are organized different way. One of the unusual things about us is we don't have departments. So all the entities are programs. So there's a little more porosity between the disciplines than at many other schools. And some faculty and some students take more advantage of that than others. So there's, you know, the degrees are accredited, so they all have sort of deep sort of rootedness in the professions, but there's more flexibility and porosity between the fields. So at the advanced level, a graduate student can, if they're an architecture student, can take a landscape architecture studio or vice versa, or get into urban design or planning as well. So I think that's a good thing.
Okay. You've been here in Austin for about 15 years.
Yeah, in 2001.
Gotten involved in any of the outside organizations in Austin, or charity work? Or?
Well, every place I've been very involved in local planning. Starting in Washington State, I worked for the county planning department during the summer, and I had an agreement where I worked during the school year 1 day a week in the county planning department, and then 4 days at the university, and I did just the opposite during the summer, and was very involved in developing for Whitman County, Washington, their comprehensive plan. Helped write the first couple drafts of the Washington Growth Management Act. And both the Whitman County Plan and the Washington Growth Management Act have had a long-lasting influence. Also helped design a pathway and bike trail between Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington, which is only 12 miles apart. In Colorado, I was involved in a number of mostly county-level growth management plans in Colorado. And was real involved in several in the Rocky Mountain area. And similarly in Arizona, probably the most impactful one was helped replan and rezone the northern 20% of Phoenix. It's 120 square miles, pretty good size area. Among other things, work in southern Arizona, a lot of work along the Arizona-Mexico border when I was there. Here, I was involved in Envision Central Texas, was the chair of Envision Central Texas, so at the regional planning level. I was on the Citizens Committee for Imagine Austin. That was the first city plan, comprehensive plan in Austin since 1979. It was passed unanimously a couple of years ago by City Council, and deeply involved in that. A lot of meetings. This is Austin, so a lot of participation. I was the president of the Hill Country Conservancy, and so one of my great pleasures in that was buying ranches, buying the conservation easements for ranches to preserve land. in the hill country, and we also are engaged in doing something called the Violet Crown Trail, which is a 34-mile sort of extension of Town Lake into the hill country. Also been involved in the Waller Creek project here in Austin, and I'm the chair of the campus planning committee, and have worked the last 5 years now on developing a new campus plan, and now doing a plan for the new hospital and medical district, and new campus landscape plan, an east side plan. So I was a resident at the American Academy in Rome last winter for 2 months, and the school ran perfectly well, and it was in really good hands, but I got more correspondence from the vice president of facilities for the university, so I know I was really working for her in campus planning, and it was in the midst of getting the medical school going and a lot of other things. So yeah, I've been very active here on campus.
Well, you mentioned Envision Central Texas. Can you characterize how that's ended up? Is it ongoing, or?
Well, I think it was a 5-county envisioning process. It had, I think, a substantial impact in some areas. I think some areas, it hasn't been realized. Maybe it's time to start another sort of round of it. The areas where I think it's been successful is, first of all, the open space planning, which has a strong tradition already in the Austin area. We worked with the Trust for Public Land and did green prints for 4 of the 5 counties. All the counties did a green prints. That's really influenced open space acquisition and so on. We also promoted what's called the centers concept, and basically concentrating development in denser centers and connecting them by and putting your transportation investment in that area. Unfortunately, the voters in Austin, I think, followed through with sort of the rail connections that were envisioned by Envision Central Texas. There's only one line that did result directly from Envision Central Texas, the red line that goes from downtown out to the Leander. So that's been a success. And along that rail line, there is developing nodes of growth that are doing what was pretty much envisioned in Envision Central Texas. And Imagine Austin, I don't think Imagine Austin was a much richer comprehensive plan as a result of Envision Central Texas. And the centers concept was refined by both CapCog for the regional planning, but also Imagine Austin. So that concept has lived on and embodied in subsequent plans. So I think that those parts have been successful. The sort of concentrating growth in certain areas like the downtown area and so on. As you look at the skyline of Austin, that's pretty much happened. Probably the rail and the diversity of transportation options proposed have been the area that's been the weakest follow through from Envision Central Texas.
And I presume you're still active in environmental planning issues here in Austin?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, Waller Creek and the Hill Country Conservancy, the most active.
Well, we've covered a lot of territory. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about?
I keep thinking of former students that have gone on to do really good things, and there's quite a lot of them.
And I'm sure they're much the better because of you. So.
Well.
But I want to thank you for spending some time with us today.
Yeah, it's been delightful.
Thank you very much.
Yep.